Miles Hartman had never believed in vagueness. In over 20 years of building Northbridge Logistics from a three-person freight crew with an old Ford pickup into a regional powerhouse, the one thing he never tolerated was a lack of clarity. To Miles, everything had to have a reason. A late delivery. Was it the rain or the driver? A broken machine? Technical fault or sabotage? A company could only run like a symphony if every note, every player, knew precisely when to come in and when to go silent. So on a Wednesday morning in August, when Miles received two reports, one from the Central Operations Department and one from Human Resources, he didn't expect that the thing he couldn't take his eyes off wasn't the numbers. The operations report was the kind that made you smile. Productivity up 6.3% in the last quarter, the lowest stock loss rate in 18 months, and the Cedar Hill branch's overnight team even crossed the 98.7% fulfillment threshold, a feat. But it was the HR report that made Miles frown. Not because it was a complaint, not even a disciplinary record. In fact, it was almost nothing at all. A short attachment, no detailed notes, no signature, no clear request for action. Only one line stood out, typed in the system's default font. Some supervisors have noted unusual behavior from a night shift employee, Javier Cruz. No violation, just out of the ordinary. Miles read and reread the words, out of the ordinary. Nothing made him more alert than non-committal phrasing. In corporate culture, out of the ordinary meant something's off but we don't want to explain. It meant we know something's wrong but don't know, or don't dare, to name it. He had seen this before, and every time it appeared, trouble followed. He clicked into the employee's file. Javier Cruz, 26 years old, joined Northbridge 18 months ago. Never late, no sick days, top 1% in productivity across the region. Every metric was unnaturally perfect. A young man, no prior logistics experience, adapting so fast some supervisors called him a machine. Miles leaned back in his chair. A familiar tension climbed his spine. That gut instinct he'd learned to trust back in the days he drove freight himself across 3 states in 4 days, without stopping overnight. Part instinct, part hard-won experience, he knew something didn't add up. A flawless employee doesn't suddenly become the subject of hushed midnight chatter in internal reports. He reopened the system email, searched for hidden forms. There, a small file tucked under unclassified. The subject line simply read, Note, J. Cruz, behavior. No sender, no content. But there was something, an attachment, an indirect audio capture from the warehouse's surveillance camera. Timestamp, 3:12 a.m., the 7th of the previous month. Footsteps, the squeak of a pallet cart, a soft clink of falling metal. Then, murmured words. Miles turned up the volume. Still damp here? Need to stack more ice. That cable's slipped again. Gotta fix it next time. No one replied. It sounded like the person was talking to himself. He replayed the clip, this time focusing on the voice. Calm, not angry, not anxious. Just focused. He looked back at the screen. Name, Javier Cruz. A perfect employee, no errors, but staying after hours unpaid to do something no one had asked. No overtime. No reason. Miles remembered another time, 2 years ago, when he had gone undercover as a delivery worker named Aaron Bell to investigate a supervisor accused of abusing single-parent staff. That journey didn't just expose a workplace bully. It led to the birth of the Safe Hands program, a company-wide protection policy for frontline labor rights. Maybe it was time to do it again. Miles stood up and opened a drawer. In the back, an old file folder. Onboarding, temp role. Inside, all the documents he'd used to create a fake identity. Bank account, job history, a fabricated profile for Derek Hayes, a divorced man, no college degree, previously employed by a now-defunct logistics firm. That afternoon, Miles called an old friend at a staffing agency, asked for an urgent schedule set up for a temp worker at Cedar Hill. No trace, no real name. By end of day, Derek Hayes had a shift starting next Monday. And once again, Miles Hartman, The CEO of a logistics empire worth hundreds of millions was preparing to start over. Hoodie, faded jeans, the same boots that had stepped through more warehouses than anyone could count. That night, he looked at himself in the mirror. No Armani suit, no boardroom lights, just a man facing the question he'd long avoided. If the very system I built is overlooking people like Javier, then what exactly am I leading? At 8 a.m. on Monday, Miles Hartman did not walk into the headquarters office, nor did he attend the weekly executive meeting as scheduled. Instead, he stood inside a rented apartment near the industrial zone south of Cedar Hill, wearing a faded gray t-shirt under a navy blue zip-up hoodie worn thin from too many washes, an old baseball cap, dark safety boots he had ordered during a site inspection 2 years back. Unshaven, the man reflected in the mirror was no longer the CEO of Northbridge Logistics, but an ordinary man, likely working a temp job with limited options. His ID badge read Derek Hayes, employee number CD3428-TEMP, night shift, starting at 6 p.m., ending at 3 a.m. No one in the system knew who Derek was, except for Miles. No special surveillance, no media crew trailing him, no special time card. He would have to push pallets, lift boxes, scan barcodes like any other temp worker. The Cedar Hill branch sat at the junction of 3 major transport routes, a key link in the Mid-South distribution chain. But the night shift here, according to the reports, was a paradox. High productivity, but an equally high turnover rate. Supervisors rotated often, temp workers came and went, and few lasted more than 3 months. At 5:42 p.m., Miles stood at the warehouse's side entrance with a gas station coffee thermos. The humid August air pressed down on his shoulders like a weight, tiring him before he'd even stepped inside. He entered the reception area, where new hires would sign paperwork, receive reflective aprons, and get their station assignments. No one looked up to ask his name. A weary-sounding, middle-aged woman asked, "Which temp agency sent you?" When he answered, she nodded and pulled a stack of papers from a drawer. "Read carefully, sign here. No phones on the floor, no photography, no personal earbuds. Follow the yellow line. You'll reach the orientation station." Miles took a warehouse map, faded with a corner torn. The yellow path led into the warehouse's center, divided into zones 1 to 5, each handling a part of the process: inbound, sorting, packing, outbound, and returns. His name was slotted into Zone 3, outbound, where sorted goods were loaded onto trucks. A tall, bald man in a dark blue supervisor shirt with a name badge reading Greg, shift lead, walked by, holding a clipboard, not looking at anyone. "Hayes, right?" Miles nodded. Greg pointed with his chin. "Zone 3, follow Cruz." That name, Cruz, hit Miles like a quiet thud in the chest. No expression, no surprise, but his hands subtly clenched. Javier Cruz. Greg offered no further explanation, no instructions, no eye contact, no welcome. Miles entered the warehouse. The first sound wasn't human voices but metal wheels rolling across concrete, barcode scanners beeping in single, regular beats. No music, no radio, no laughter. Under the pale industrial lights moved shadowy figures in orange reflective vests, heads low, pacing methodically between shelves towering overhead. No one stopped. No one spoke. No one looked directly at anyone else. He passed sorting, then packing, and finally reached the edge of Zone 3. There, right at the pallet intake corner, stood a young man, lean build, black hair tied back, adjusting a box with his left hand while scanning barcodes with his right at an astonishing pace. His reflective vest had slipped off one shoulder. Thin gloves. His motions were precise, like he had rehearsed them 1,000 times. Miles slowed. "Excuse me. Greg told me to find Cruz." The man didn't look up, just flicked his eyes and nodded slightly. "Grab an empty pallet. You know how?" Miles nodded. "I'm Derek. First day." Javier didn't reply. He pointed at the instruction codes taped to the side of the workbench, then resumed. Miles quietly followed. The first hour passed without a word beyond what was strictly work-related. Javier only spoke when necessary. "This code's for Western route. Type 3, bottom stack." Or, "Careful at that corner. Wheels slip easy." He didn't miss a beat. But the strange part wasn't how Javier worked. It was how everyone else seemed to avoid him. A few nodded as they passed, but no one stopped. No one chatted. No one joked. A young worker who accidentally bumped into Javier immediately muttered, "Sorry," then turned away pale. A girl approaching the water station saw Javier adjusting a leaking hose, paused, then veered off in another direction. Javier worked like a ghost, present but untouched, moving through a space others didn't dare acknowledge. Miles stayed composed, but his mind was racing. This man wasn't exactly friendly, but he didn't seem like trouble either. He simply didn't belong here, like someone playing chess alone while others were still learning how to set the board. 9:15 p.m., the start of a 15-minute break. Everyone spilled out toward the break zone near the loading dock, where a few vending machines, broken-legged plastic chairs, and a warped wooden table waited. Some smoked, some ate, some stared at their phones. Miles sat on a wooden crate, pretending to check messages. Javier didn't come to the break area. He quietly stepped behind a row of shelving, just out of camera range, and began picking up stray trash, leftover packing ties, inspecting a metal beam with a small crack, then stopped by a firebox. He opened the lid, checked the pressure gauge, then jotted something into a small folded notepad before tucking it into his back pocket. Miles didn't understand. No one asked him to. No one was watching. No bonus. No overtime. No benefit. Why? After break, they returned to the station. The entire night shift went on like that, in silence with careful, uncanny precision from a man the entire warehouse seemed unsure how to engage with. Near 3 a.m., when the shift ended, Miles bent to re-tie his laces, scanning the area. Most workers had left, calling out tired goodbyes, engines rumbling from the parking lot. Javier didn't leave. He quietly walked toward the back of the maintenance zone, where there was only a narrow door and a row of rarely used equipment lockers. Miles felt it, that this was where the real story would begin, and maybe where the truth would finally come undone. There's a kind of silence in industrial life that no management book ever describes. It's not the quiet of deep forests or the stillness of a boardroom after a major decision. It's a suffocating silence, made of repetitive engine hums, wheels rolling on old concrete, barcode scanners beeping in sync like a compressed heartbeat. And within that constant rhythm, there are strange voids, people who exist without leaving a trace. Javier Cruz was one of those. For the next 3 nights, Miles continued his night shifts in Zone 3, always sticking close to Javier without drawing attention to his watchfulness. And the more he observed, the more he realized Javier wasn't a good employee, not in the usual sense. He wasn't exceptional, flashy, or creative in ways that got noticed. Javier was the kind of person who unsettled people. He was never late, never engaged in small talk, never complained. He followed every protocol to the letter, yet handled unexpected issues faster than anyone else. One time, a package jammed the conveyor belt. Javier didn't call for support. He stepped back, pressed gently on the jam point, then slid under the frame like someone who had measured every inch of space. The box dislodged without a sound, under 10 seconds. No one noticed. No one cared, except Miles. Miles began listening to how others spoke about Javier, or more precisely, how they didn't. When asked, "Who's the best on the night shift?" people dodged the question. A burly guy named Murphy shook his head. Probably Cruz. But, no one wants to stand near him for too long. Someone else chimed in. "He's weird. Knows all the system's weak spots, but never says anything. Just fixes them." In the break area, there was a whispered tale shared whenever someone new joined. "You seen Cruz yet? Doesn't eat. Doesn't talk. Works like a machine. Might not be human." They had a nickname for him, Mr. Ghost. Miles initially dismissed it as nonsense, but then he noticed Javier never took snacks from the vending machines. He brought his own food, always plain white rice without any noticeable smell. No coffee, no soda, no chewing gum, no smoking. During breaks, he avoided crowds, choosing quiet corners, always keeping his hands busy, collecting stray straps, adjusting firebox lids, inspecting pallet wheels. Miles realized something. Javier didn't do these things because he was asked to. He did them because he couldn't not do them. On the fourth night, a minor incident occurred. The auxiliary belt between Zone 2 and Zone 3 jammed. Boxes got stuck at the transfer point. Greg, the shift lead, strolled over lazily and muttered, "Call maintenance. Probably won't come till tomorrow." He scribbled a few words on his clipboard. "Shut it down. Reroute to Zone 4. But Javier didn't stay still. He crouched down, checked the wiring, pulled out a twisted cable, reached beneath the metal bar, tightened a bolt with his bare hands, then restarted the belt. It ran smoothly. Greg said nothing. No one thanked him. The boxes continued moving like nothing had ever broken. Miles stood a few steps away, pretending to rearrange boxes. But now it wasn't just curiosity. It was a quiet rage. No praise, no recognition. No one even asked, "Do you need a hand?" Javier returned to his workstation. Same pace, same focus, unchanged. What troubled Miles more was that Javier never looked at anyone for more than a second. No eye contact with coworkers, no response to off-topic questions. Yet in those brief glances, Miles sensed something, not coldness, but a thick layer of self-protection. At 2:53 a.m., just minutes before the shift ended, Miles deliberately dropped a small package. The box dented, plastic wrap torn, a few inner items spilled out. He bent to pick them up slowly. Javier approached. No words. He pulled fresh tape from his pocket, resealed the box. Gently, precisely. Then pushed the pallet back into position. No scolding, no judgmental looks, not a word. Miles watched him walk away, disappearing quietly toward the far end of the warehouse. And then, like a reflex, a memory flashed in Miles' mind. Years ago, when he was still a driver, delivering freight across Nebraska. He had once stood in freezing rain, truck stalled, no support call answered. Back then, a manager had shown up, said nothing, just crouched down and rewired the ignition. When it worked, the man said only, "Just remember the time someone helped you, and do the same for others, even if no one's watching." Javier, without saying it, was living exactly that. Miles returned to his rental apartment as dawn crept in. He didn't turn off the nightlight, didn't play music. He sat on the floor, opened his laptop. He pulled up internal reports, all logs from Zone 3 over the past 12 months. At least 7 entries labeled, "Minor issue, resolved." But none named who resolved them. No cameras captured it. No thanks recorded. No names. Each event passed as if things had just worked out. But Miles knew better. Worked out meant someone was quietly making sure everything didn't collapse. And then, the biggest question began to form. Who is Javier trying to protect? Because someone like him doesn't do this to impress anyone. He didn't want gratitude. He wasn't proving anything. It wasn't about points. It wasn't about a raise. It could be because of an old wound, one this system had never dared to face. And for the first time, Miles felt afraid, not of Javier, but of himself. Because all this time, while reports came in, while charts and efficiency metrics fluctuated each day, he had never asked, who's doing the work no one is measuring? At the Cedar Hill warehouse, breaks always came at 3 fixed intervals, 9:15 p.m., 11:30 p.m., and 1:45 a.m., each lasting exactly 15 minutes. In theory, these were moments for workers to relax, drink water, rest, or grab a quick bite. But for Javier Cruz, break time had never really meant taking a break. And for Miles Hartman, now living under the alias Derek Hayes, these fleeting minutes became the first open doors into the inner world of this mysterious worker. On the 5th night, right after a short whistle blew from the control station, workers began leaving their posts, trickling toward the break area in the rear. Some rushed to vending machines. Some squatted against the wall, their phones lighting up tired screens. A few joked, some cursed quietly, others simply laid their heads down on the warped table like they were borrowing the darkness to catch up on the sleep life had stolen. But Javier was nowhere among them. Miles quietly left the group and followed the direction Javier had gone the previous night. No rush, not too close, just enough to keep him in sight. Javier was in the West Corridor, where old shelving units had been repurposed to store surplus materials, wrap rolls, tape, leftover bolts. He didn't sit, didn't open a meal, just stood reviewing a handwritten checklist, a small, worn piece of paper folded into quarters, with at least 10 lines of blue ink notes. Each one flagged a potential issue. Hydraulic pipe in loading zone hissing, check valve. Loose nail on lift base, risk of slipping. Pallet R7 tilting, replace if warped by morning shift. He didn't take photos, didn't log anything into the company app, just handwritten notes, folded back, slipped into his pocket. Miles stood in silence. Javier's quiet made everything else in the warehouse feel loud, and it made one question echo louder than ever. If no one like Javier existed, how fast would this system fall apart? Just then, a voice spoke behind him. "You new here?" Miles turned. A young woman with short hair and a slender face stood there. Her name badge read, Monica, part-time. She held a soda can that had clearly gone flat. "I've seen you following crews," she said. "Be careful." Miles feigned confusion. "Careful of what?" Monica exhaled sharply. "Not like dangerous, just weird. He works like someone's watching him, like he has to keep everything perfect or someone will die." She took the last sip and tossed the can into a distant metal bin. "I once asked him why he keeps fixing stuff during breaks. He just said, 'Because I've been to the hospital more than home.' Gave me chills. Don't know if it was true or just his way of telling me to back off." She gave a small smile, then walked away, leaving Miles with the feeling of having been handed a piece of a map, but still no starting point. That night, after the shift ended and most people had left the warehouse, Miles didn't head out. He waited behind a steel column and watched Javier, carrying his familiar tool pouch, disappear down a dim, unused hallway. No hesitation, no map, as if he already knew exactly where the next crack in the system was about to form. And for the first time, Miles decided to follow. He moved slowly, boots grazing the cold cement floor, keeping distance but never losing track. The headlamp attached to Javier's cap beamed a narrow light across every detail he examined. A squeaky metal door hinge, a fuse box with a faint burn mark near the terminal. Then he stopped, pulling from his pocket a short wire, wire cutters, voltage tester, electrical tape, his hands moving quickly, confidently. Miles stood behind a door, heartbeat slow, but mind racing. None of the people he had ever promoted, none of the ones who wrote reports, who earned safety awards, who sat on state-level occupational boards, none of them worked for the reasons Javier did. Javier didn't care to be seen, but clearly he had lost something so great it forced him to never overlook even a mislatched safety harness. After 30 minutes, Javier emerged, leaving behind a tiny note in the corner of the room. Replaced fuse. Monitor hissing after 5-hour cycle. No signature. No logo. No one would ever know. And Miles understood. The things people often labeled as self-healing systems, proactive protocols, were actually being held up by one man. A man they mockingly called Mr. Ghost, but who might be the only soul still truly alive in a system slowly dying of emotional neglect. The 6th night shift began with an incident. The lights in the outbound area, where Javier and Miles worked, started flickering just as the shift kicked off. The machine still hummed steadily, but the lighting was no longer stable. Some bulbs made clicking noises, then one near Javier's station popped softly. The glass dimmed to black. Zone 3 was immediately swallowed in a pale, ghostly haze, like the night had crept into the very heart of the warehouse. Greg, still Greg, looked up at the ceiling and shrugged. "Tech team again. I'll file a report. Probably show up tomorrow." Then he turned and walked off, as if a blown bulb were just bad weather. A few workers hesitated, reluctant to step into the dim. One whispered, "How do we scan barcodes if we can't see?" Another said even softer, "Just take it slow. Crews will fix it anyway." And just like they expected, Javier didn't say a word. He walked over to an old equipment locker, pulled out a portable floodlight, turned it on, and hooked it temporarily to a rack post near the station. A soft yellow glow spread across the floor, not bright, but enough to see. Javier knelt again and resumed work like light had never been part of the conditions. Miles stood there, chest tightening like an air compressor slowly filling with pressure. It wasn't the supervisor's indifference that got to him. He had expected that. It was how naturally everyone accepted it. They all knew Cruz would fix it, but no one thought that was a problem. And so things continued as if nothing had interrupted them. But there was one difference. The floodlight only illuminated a portion of the zone. Pallets on the other side were left in darkness. Barcode scanners glitched. Some shipments were mislabeled, but no one logged it or reported it. The night became a sequence of half-aware motions. Only Javier remained unchanged. The 11:30 p.m. break arrived. Greg didn't bother checking in on Zone 3. Monica didn't greet anyone, just pulled a chair away from the vending machine and took out her phone. The rest quietly chewed snacks, drank coffee, eyes down. Miles stayed behind, pretending to review a clipboard, but his eyes stayed fixed on the old hallway, where Javier, like always, had disappeared. This time he didn't follow immediately. He wanted to see how long it would take Greg to check back in. The answer, no one did. 15 minutes passed, then 20. Javier didn't return. When Miles finally got up to go look, he heard footsteps behind him. It was Monica. "You're following him, huh?" she asked bluntly. Her voice wasn't suspicious, just tired. Miles froze. He nodded slowly. "Be careful," Monica said again, then pulled something from her jacket pocket and held it out. A wrinkled, faded photo, clearly shot on film. In it was a man in an old logistics uniform, the same kind Javier wore now, only the color had faded. The man stood next to a little boy, maybe 6 years old, black hair, eyes cast downward. Miles looked closer. The boy was Javier, as a child. "His dad used to work here," Monica said softly. "Slipped in the old loading zone. Oil leak from a busted tank. No one reported it. He fell. Spinal injury. Permanent damage." Miles swallowed hard. A sharp twinge hit behind his ribs. A quiet question surfaced in his mind. How many people have had to survive silence just to make up for the voices we ignored? That night, Miles didn't need to search for Javier. He already knew what he was doing, fixing everything the system had once abandoned. Not because anyone asked, but because memory refused to stay silent. The shift ended at 3:30 a.m. Miles still hadn't left. He stood outside the warehouse near an old pickup truck, looking up at the dim streetlights. Javier emerged, unaware Miles was nearby, carrying his same worn canvas bag, walking slowly, as if the exhaustion wasn't in his muscles, but in the effort it took to live with integrity in a place no one cared to look. Miles spoke. "Need a ride?" Javier paused, turned, surprised but not defensive. Just a small shake of the head. "I walk. It's close." Miles nodded but stayed put. "I know about your dad." Javier didn't respond. He just stared at him for a long moment, then gave a single slight nod and turned away, vanishing into the dark. But that moment, brief, simple, marked a shift. No longer was this a one-sided indifference. For the first time, someone knew, someone listened, someone didn't walk away. And Miles understood. He was no longer a CEO investigating. He was now a witness to a system that had stayed silent for far too long. And tonight, even without electricity, he saw everything more clearly than ever before. The internal safety map of the Cedar Hill warehouse had long been considered a point of pride. A neat digital diagram, integrating data from sensors, cameras, and routine reports filed by floor supervisors. But Javier Cruz had never trusted that map, because it only reflected what the system chose to acknowledge. The real dangers, the hairline cracks in the foundation, the strange metal vibrations, the blind spots the cameras couldn't see, were only detectable by someone who had once watched his father fall onto the concrete floor. Miles Hartman, or rather Ethan Miles Hartman, CEO of the entire logistics system, now stood before something he had never encountered in his 17 years as a leader. A map not found in any system. It was hand-drawn, with red marker, on a folded craft paper sheet, its edges torn and creased. And each red dot on it wasn't just a potential hazard. Each dot marked a place where Javier had made a fix, a place where he had prevented an accident, and no one knew. Ethan discovered it on the 7th night, after deliberately staying later than Javier. Inside an old drawer near the repair zone, one no one ever looked at. He found it. Alongside it, a small notebook filled with dozens of entries, dates, error codes, technical notes. At the bottom of each page, in small italic handwriting, no more fathers should go home on a stretcher. Ethan sat down on a rotting wooden stool, the light from his phone casting a dim glow across his face. He flipped through the notebook, his heart slowing with each line, messy handwriting, but with military precision. April 11th, coil number 13 about to snap, secured with secondary clip. April 14th, emergency exit handle in zone C stuck, needs lubrication. April 17th, post number 21, vibrating lightly, check anchor base. He couldn't believe this was the work of a temp employee. No title, no authority, no support tools from the system. Ethan closed the notebook. He didn't speak a word, but in his mind a decision had already been made. The next morning he left Cedar Hill without informing anyone, flew straight to headquarters in Columbus, Ohio. No meetings, no explanations to the executive team. He called only one person, Celine Brooks, Regional Director of Safety, who for the past 3 months had been consistently submitting reports titled, ISO Standards Fully Met. "I need you at Cedar Hill next week," Ethan said, his voice calm but razor sharp. "Is there a problem, sir?" "Not a problem," he replied. "Everything we've been failing to see." 3 days later, Celine arrived at Cedar Hill. Ethan met her in an old conference room. On the table were 3 items: the hand-drawn map, the notebook, and a printed snapshot of the warehouse's internal safety reports. He laid them out without comment, then asked, "Do you see the difference?" Celine picked up the red dotted map. Her face paled, not because it was inaccurate, but because it was more accurate than the official company map. "Where did this come from?" she stammered. "It doesn't matter," Ethan interrupted. "What matters is that for the past 4 months, the only person keeping this warehouse from a fatal accident is someone the system has never once acknowledged." Celine swallowed. "I'll check in with the supervisors." "No need," Ethan said. "We're not revising a report. We're tearing down the structure that forced crews to quietly replace an entire technical department." For the first time in Celine's career, a CEO didn't ask for a file or a dashboard. He asked, "How do we stop good people from falling into the shadows like this?" That night, Javier, as always, wore his familiar tool pouch, walked into the maintenance zone after his shift, still unaware that the world around him was beginning to shift. But this time, Miles didn't follow from afar. He stepped forward, held out the map and said, "I've seen it." Javier froze. His eyes widened. His hand stalled on the strap of his bag. But he didn't run. He didn't deny. He asked only one thing. "What are you going to do with it?" Ethan looked him in the eye. And for the first time, he said something Ethan would never forget. "If that map gets displayed, please don't erase the red dots. Don't replace them with pretty icons, because each dot is a moment I couldn't cry." Ethan nodded, and in that moment, something settled in his heart, clearer than ever before. To restore justice, sometimes all it takes is a hand-drawn map, and someone brave enough to believe it's real. Cedar Hill had 12 main doors, clearly marked in every operational diagram, every fire safety plan, and even on the wall in the break room. Each door was numbered from Dock 1 to Dock 12, equipped with sensors, regularly inspected, and logged 24/7. But once, Javier Cruz had quietly said to Miles, more like a whisper than a statement, "The most dangerous door is the one no one believes exists." At the time, Miles had thought he was speaking in metaphor. Until that night, after their shift, when Javier left earlier than usual, perhaps knowing he'd already been found out, Miles walked along the old hallway, his hand trailing over the cracked walls as if following hidden signs. Then he saw it, a metal door with no number, no barcode, painted a dull shade of gray that matched the concrete walls, tucked behind an unused shelf and a stack of dust-covered damaged pallets. No lock, no sensor. Not a single reference to it in the company system. There was a faint, greasy fingerprint on the door handle, and beside it, barely visible, was a faded marker scrawl, "Don't open unless you're ready to see the truth." Miles stood there a long time. Part of him wanted to turn around, to pretend he hadn't seen it, but he'd come too far to back down. He placed his hand on the handle. The door creaked open. Dry metal, rusted silence, the sound of time and abandonment. Inside, no lights, no windows. But when he turned on his flashlight, what came into view left him frozen. It wasn't garbage. It wasn't an abandoned storage room. It was a fully functional, self-built repair station, complete with tools, diagrams, test rigs, fire extinguishers, electrical cables, connectors. And in the center, a 3D model of the entire Cedar Hill warehouse, meticulously built from recycled materials, down to the smallest detail. On the model, red markings matched the blood map Javier had once drawn, but this time there were blue markings too. Points with no incidents yet, but which Javier had assessed as likely to fail soon. Miles stepped toward a shelf. There was a small file box filled with photographs, evidence of past incidents that had never been reported. Scorched wiring, collapsed pallets, bent shelving, nails fallen from the ceiling. In one image, Greg stood smiling with a coffee cup in hand, unaware he was near a dangerously rotted shipment crate. At the end of the workbench was a notebook. On the first page, unofficial log, only for those brave enough to see the truth. Miles flipped it open. The first line hit him like a punch to the chest. June 2015, my father fell in loading zone 4. No cameras. No one took responsibility. They signed the settlement, but they never apologized. 34 pages followed, one per week, each filled with technical notes, warnings, safety concerns, system errors. At the bottom of each page, no name, just a symbol, a triangle with a horizontal slash, the international sign for latent hazard. Miles felt like he was standing in front of a memorial, not of rebellion, but of unseen dedication. He left the room in silence, closed the door, not to ignore it, but to remember exactly where it was. The next morning, he summoned the entire supervisory team into the old meeting room. No warning, no agenda. Has anyone here ever heard of the 13th door? He asked. Silence. Greg furrowed his brow. Monica looked puzzled. No one answered. Exactly, Miles nodded, because it's not on any diagram. But it exists, and inside that door is proof that one person has been silently doing the work of an entire safety department for 3 years, in the dark. He didn't need to shout or raise his voice. He simply laid out the photos, the hand-drawn map, the notebook excerpts. The room went dead quiet. Greg turned red. I didn't know, he began. That's the problem, Miles cut in. No one knew. No one wanted to. He stood up, walked around the table, and said one thing. Starting tomorrow, Cedar Hill will no longer have 12 doors. It will have 13, and the 13th door will become the new safety center for the entire system. The one running it will be Javier Cruz. No one clapped, but in their eyes something broke, an old habit, a wall of silence. Javier said nothing when he heard the news. He simply looked at Miles for a long time, then finally said, I was just doing my part. And Miles replied, We made you carry ours too. Now it's time to take it back. 4 days after the meeting that announced the 13th door, the Columbus office sent an urgent report to Miles. It contained the official personnel list for Cedar Hill over the past 3 years. Names, employee numbers, shift records, contracts, everything meticulously updated. But out of the 217 records, one name was missing, Javier Cruz. Not as a typo, not an oversight, simply non-existent. Miles called HR immediately. The line was transferred 3 times before a nervous female staffer picked up. We've checked again, she said hesitantly. That name isn't in the central system. Miles pressed. He's been working at Cedar Hill for 3 years, on night shift. There are witnesses, there are work logs, but the voice on the other end answered quietly, almost like a confession. Maybe. He was contracted through a third party. Miles hung up, his mind already racing. For 3 years, who had made sure Javier remained off the books? And why? That night, he returned to Cedar Hill with his personal laptop and logged into the internal archive system. Data doesn't lie, but whoever controls the data can make the truth disappear. He searched through the automatic time card entries. Every swipe left a timestamp. Javier had clocked in every night, But the employee ID on his badge wasn't linked to any file. Instead of a name, it read TEMP-CZ-9412. Temp meant temporary staff. CZ was the regional code. But 9412 matched no internal assignment Miles had ever approved. He ran a deeper query into the root system. A hidden folder emerged. Inactive external. There it was. Javier Cruz. But not in the company's own logs. The record had been entered by a subcontractor. Miles called legal immediately, demanding access to every staffing contract from the past 3 years. One name stood out. Everway Logistics LLC, a subsidiary once owned by a regional VP who had been reassigned 6 months ago following a labor reporting scandal. A crack began to open. Miles requested Everway's payroll files. Among hundreds of names, there was Javier, but the wages were bare minimum. No insurance, no hazard pay, no performance evaluations. Each entry marked with 2 words only, labor only. For 3 years, Javier had been the only person permanently assigned to Cedar Hill through that contractor. Yet he had never been recognized as an official employee, meaning if he were injured, the company held no responsibility. If he died on shift, the system could wash its hands and call it a third-party incident. Miles clenched his fists. What he saw now wasn't just injustice, it was systemic manipulation. The next day, he summoned Javier to his office. No temporary badge. No going through Greg. He handwrote Javier's name on a piece of paper and taped it on the meeting room door. Javier Cruz, meet the CEO at 1900 hours. Security will confirm. Javier entered quietly as always, still wearing the same faded jacket, still carrying the same worn tool bag. Miles showed him the complete file. Did you know, he asked, your name has never been officially recognized by the company? Javier nodded, unshaken. Calm. I know, he said. Why didn't you say anything? Because if I did, they might replace me. I don't know if the next person would notice the cracks in the concrete foundation like I do. If they'd bend down to pick up loose wires like I do. If I spoke up, I might lose my place. But if I stayed silent, at least the warehouse floor stayed intact. Miles had no words. In that moment, he saw in the young man's eyes a sacrifice the company had never earned. The following day, Miles sent an email summoning HR, legal, and all regional execs to a meeting. The subject line read only, Invisible Man Audit. In the meeting, he presented one image. A man who had worked 1,095 consecutive days, missed no shifts, fixed hundreds of technical faults, prevented dozens of potential accidents, yet had no employee ID, no official time card, no insurance, no vacation, no mention in any monthly report. He said, this is not an oversight. This is a crime of indifference. One regional director spoke up. Sir, we can't track every external contractor. Miles looked directly at him, voice lowered but sharp as a blade. If one man can silently reshape the entire safety culture of a warehouse, then claiming we can't track them is just a legal way of ignoring human value. The next morning, a system-wide internal announcement was released. As of today, Javier Cruz is officially recognized as a full-time employee. Position, Regional Safety Coordinator. Employee ID, CRZ-001, and his name will be listed on the company-wide personnel map under the line, the first to sign his name without permission. Some didn't understand. Some were confused. But at Cedar Hill, no one objected. Because from now on, when someone asks, who is Javier? They won't need to say much. They'll simply point toward the 13th door, where a new sign has just been painted. This is where the system once forgot, and he never let us fall. The 13th door was no longer shut. Inside, a warm yellow light glowed every evening from a newly installed bulb. The maps, logs, and handwritten notes that were once hidden were now neatly arranged on metal shelves, labeled clearly, On-Site Operational Records, as observed by personnel. Javier hadn't changed his routine overnight. He still showed up early, still moved through the hallways like a shadow, still adjusted exposed wires by hand, checked the pressure gauges on fire extinguishers, wiped oil stains left by others on the floor. But something had changed. People now saw him, and people had started to speak. On Tuesday night, a young worker named Ava recently transferred from a Kansas branch, stood outside the break room, watching Javier as he adjusted an outlet panel nearby. She asked softly, "You're the one who made the red map, right?" Javier didn't turn, just nodded. "My sister once broke her leg from an unreported oil leak. Thank you for not ignoring the things everyone else called no big deal." It was the first time Javier had ever heard someone thank him directly, and the first time he looked someone in the eye and asked, "What's your sister's name?" Ava smiled. "She doesn't work anymore, but if she knew someone like you was here, maybe she wouldn't have quit." That night, Javier didn't leave right after his shift. He stayed inside the 13th door, looking at the map he had once drawn in red marker. For the first time, he added a new color, green, for hope. And in the bottom right corner of the map, he added a small line in fine-tip pen. "This is where our story begins." A week later, a large piece of paper appeared outside the room. "Have you ever witnessed something no one believed? Tell it." Javier didn't sign his name. He just taped the sign up, placed a small cardboard box underneath it, filled with blank sheets and ink pens. At first, no one wrote anything. They glanced, walked past. Some smiled faintly. Then on a Wednesday night, Javier discovered a folded note inside the box. When he opened it, a clumsy scrawl read, "I saw the suspension wires on rack 2 were nearly torn. Told the manager, they said, we'll check tomorrow." I skipped my shift the next day. 3 days later, the rack collapsed. No one got hurt, but I still feel guilty. Thank you for letting me write this. No name. But it was the first time Javier felt the silence begin to crack. Then came another note, and another, then 10 more. Someone shared about a cracked air hose that blasted cold air into their neck all winter. Someone else spoke of a rattling shelf that shook every time a forklift passed. One person named Marcus, formerly a technician, wrote, "I got penalized for pulling an emergency shutoff when I saw sparks at Dock 7. If I hadn't, the warehouse might have caught fire." Each story was like a breeze, gentle but strong enough to stir years of stillness. Miles knew this. He quietly monitored the box, and one Saturday evening, he walked into the room, without warning, and sat beside Javier. "I want to take this board system-wide," he said. "Call it the silent listener, a space where anyone can tell what they saw, even if no one else believed them." Javier was silent for a moment. "Silent listener?" he repeated. "Yes," Miles said. "Not listening with ears, but with attitude, with actions taken after hearing." Javier nodded. "If you really do it, I'll be the first to read every line." Miles smiled. "No, you won't be the first. I've already started." He handed Javier a printed sheet. On it was Miles's own story. From 2004, when he ignored a warning from a rookie worker, thinking, "They're too green to know better." A week later, a hanging rig collapsed, nearly crushing an operator. "I apologized to that worker, but he had already quit, and I never saw him again." At the bottom of the page, Miles had written, "Writing down what we once ignored is the only way to ensure it won't be ignored again." The following week, Cedar Hill began to change. In the night shift break room, a new whiteboard appeared, titled, "What I Once Saw." Beneath it were yellow, pink, blue, and orange sticky notes, each one with different handwriting. Some were about technical flaws, some were HR complaints, some were tiny, like "the chair in the cafeteria has a wobbly leg." But the important thing was, people began to write, and then they began to listen. A woman named Lydia, who worked in tallying, had once been dismissed as talkative for pointing out too many operational flaws. After the board appeared, she was invited to join the new safety review team. Javier sat next to her. "I still talk a lot," she said, "but now they pay me for it." Greg, the formerly indifferent supervisor, also changed. Not a complete 180, but enough to surprise people. One day he walked into the warehouse, saw Javier inspecting the emergency ladder, and instead of turning away like before, he stepped closer and said slowly, "I used to think I knew this warehouse inside and out. Now I'm learning again." But there was one thing Javier had never done: talk about his father. One night, while standing on the rooftop of the warehouse with Miles, overlooking the entire space, Miles asked, "Did they ever apologize?" "No," Javier replied. "And you? Have you forgiven them?" Javier thought for a moment. The wind blew softly around them. He spoke slowly. I'm not doing this to get an apology. I do it because I don't want anyone else to wait for an apology before they start fixing what's broken. Miles was silent. Then he placed a hand on Javier's shoulder. That's the best answer I've ever heard, he said. Inside the 13th door, there is now a small table, 2 chairs, and a tea kettle. At the end of every shift, a few people stop by. Some share stories. Some just sit. But they come because they know that here someone will listen, without judgment, without hurry, without forgetting. Cedar Hill is no longer just a warehouse. It is becoming a place with memory, with names, with real people. Monday, 3 a.m. Javier crouched down at the corner of rack 17, where the concrete floor had unexpectedly sunken into a thin trench, long, narrow, like a cut across skin. He placed his hand on it, feeling the fracture, barely a few millimeters wide. But anyone who had once watched a warehouse floor collapse from a tiny crack would never underestimate such a thing again. He marked the area, drew a red circle with a marker, and stuck a small sign beside it. Potential floor fracture, immediate inspection required. At the time, no one on the shift noticed. Some were busy scanning barcodes, others sealing boxes. Greg was off checking inventory at Dock 4. Javier stood, logged the time in his notebook, then snapped a photo using his pocket camera. That was always the first step in any investigation he undertook. Document, photograph, report. But this time, he did something different. He didn't send an email. He didn't submit a form. He waited, not because he forgot, but because he wanted to know. Would anyone else notice? Had a system that had been awakened gone back to sleep? 3 days passed. No one touched the warning sign. No technician came to inspect it. No supervisor responded. The red circle remained at the floor's edge like a question mark no one bothered to answer. And then, on the 4th night, a pallet weighing nearly 400 pounds was dragged across the zone. One of the wheels shifted. The floor dipped slightly. A soft crack echoed. There was no accident. But Javier had been standing right there. He stopped the lift truck, said nothing, bent down, redrew the circle, this time with a darker outline. He added another sign. Second warning issued. He printed a small map, accurately marking the at-risk zone, and taped it directly to the central bulletin board in the warehouse. And for the first time, instead of the usual safety symbol at the bottom right, he wrote a short message. The cracks are not just in the floor. They exist in the places we think we don't need to look. The next day, Greg tore down the map, took it to the front office. 3 hours later, Javier received a summons. Report to Regional Executive Board, urgent. Second floor meeting room, 6 people, 3 open laptops, 1 projector screen, no smiles, no water, just a blunt question. Do you realize you're creating unnecessary alarm? Javier didn't reply. Another voice irritated. I get that you're a responsible worker, but posting unverified information in a live warehouse can create serious misunderstandings. Javier laid out his map on the table. Every fracture zone marked, time-stamped, with temperature-based concrete condition notes. I'm not causing alarm, he said calmly. I'm issuing a warning. A representative from technical services pushed back. Then why didn't you file a report properly through the system? Javier looked him in the eye. Because I've submitted 23 of them in the past 3 years, and not once did I receive a response. 7 locations I flagged were ignored. 3 led to accidents. 2 people resigned due to untreated injuries. 1, I don't even know if they can walk properly anymore. Silence fell. Miles wasn't present that day. He was in New York, attending meetings. But shortly after, he received an email, not from Javier, but from someone unexpected. Greg. Subject line, I was wrong. The message was short, unpolished. I used to think taping up signs like that disrupted procedure. Now I see, he was putting people above the system. If anyone should be held accountable for that crack, it's me, not Javier. Miles printed the email, sent it to the entire executive board. Attached was a photo of Javier's map, with a thick red circle on the concrete floor. A week later, Javier was no longer the regional safety coordinator. He was promoted to a new role, Confidential Infrastructure Supervisor, Labor Conditions Division, a position that had never existed in company history. No one quite understood what the title meant, but within a month, every warehouse under the network began posting updated floor maps weekly. Each map included a community risk report section, handwritten by workers themselves. And once a month, Javier personally visited every red mark spot workers identified. No executive sign-off required. A veteran staff member said, "No one ever asked us if the floor had problems. Now someone not only asks, but comes back. And when they return, they bring a marker, not a clipboard to check names off." And then one night after Cedar Hill closed its final shift, Javier quietly returned to the old spot, the corner beneath rack 17. The crack had been repaired, the concrete poured fresh, the surface flat as if it had never been wounded. He knelt, placed his hand on it, gently, not to test its integrity, but as if touching a memory. A tiny fracture, once nearly catastrophic, had been acknowledged, because someone had insisted that small doesn't mean insignificant, and that someone was now finally called by the right name, in the right role, with the respect he deserved. Javier pulled out a black marker, wrote a small note on a white label by the floor's edge. "It's not the concrete that holds a warehouse upright, it's the people who refuse to let it fall." They began to appear, not with fanfare, not introducing themselves, not summoned by any directive. One person paused before a tilted stack of boxes, straightening them even though it wasn't their shift. Another wiped up oil that had spilled beneath a shared workstation. A young woman picked up a box cutter left in the aisle and affixed it to the metal board with a note. "Please return after use." No orders were given. No internal memos circulated. But ever since Javier's red map was made public, a new kind of culture began to quietly spread. A culture that didn't require microphones, just someone brave enough to observe and kind enough to act. Javier called them fire starters, not because they did anything grand, but because they chose not to ignore the small things. Cedar Hill had once been a warehouse of noise, forklifts screeching, straps snapping, alarms blaring, people shouting. Now it began to harbor silences, not tense silences, but ones filled with awareness. Someone would pause, someone would listen, someone would bend down to untangle a cord, and miraculously, others began to follow their lead. One day, at 3:47 a.m., Javier stepped out from the maintenance area and saw an A4 sheet taped to a steel column in the middle of the floor. No logo, no name, just one line. "I saw a fault. I fixed it. You see a fault? What will you do?" Just below, someone had sketched a small map in pencil, area around lift number 3, and noted, "Maintenance lock is loose. Tightened it. Needs replacement." At the bottom, an arrow pointed toward the 13th door. Javier took the paper, brought it into the room, and pinned it to the notice board. Then he added a line in red. "This anonymous person just made all of us safer." From the next day on, at least one such piece of paper appeared each week. Sometimes it was a warning, sometimes a small story. "I once slipped on these stairs. Now I've added non-slip tape." Some days, just a reminder. "I saw the camera in the blind spot. I don't know what it captures, but that area has always made me uneasy." Those who had never had a voice now began to leave their marks. Nameless, but real. Miles arrived on a Friday night, unannounced. No escort, no invitation. He wore a simple jacket, walking down the hallway like someone visiting an old friend. When he reached the 13th door, he stood before the wall filled with sticky notes, maps, photos, annotations, and a small wooden sign engraved with, "Here, the small things matter." Miles read each line, sometimes nodding, sometimes pausing. There was a note written in Spanish, one drawn with a shaky hand. A scrawled line read, "For the first time, I feel that what I notice has value." He turned to Javier. "You didn't change this place with a system. You changed it by example." Javier replied simply, "I just did what I once wished someone had done for my father." Miles looked at him for a long moment, then said, "I'm going to plan to replicate this room across the entire system." Javier hesitated. "I'm not sure others are ready." "No one is ever ready," Miles interrupted. But they deserve the chance. 2 weeks later, Javier was invited to another warehouse, Riverside, Missouri, where a minor accident had occurred due to a pallet slip. He didn't come as an investigator, but as someone to share experience. On the way, Javier remained silent. He carried a small box. Inside were safety maps created by the workers at Cedar Hill. Each pen stroke, each ink mark, each annotation like, "Be cautious here. The floor tends to shake," or "should add a light at this corner." Upon arrival, he requested to meet the 3 night shift workers present during the incident. No meeting room, no minutes. Just an old wooden chair, a glass of water, and the first question, "What did you see that no one else did that day?" At first, they were silent. Then one said, "I heard the wire creaking, but I thought someone else would report it." Another said, "I intended to post a warning, but the supervisor often removes those papers, so I let it go." Javier didn't take notes. He just listened. Then he took out a map from Cedar Hill and showed it to them. "This is the first one I drew. Back then, I only had a marker. No authority, no title. But now, this map is helping over 300 people work more safely." He placed it on the table. "If you want, Riverside can have its first map tonight." They agreed. That night, Javier and the 3 workers lit up the area, posted papers, marked hazards. Each step mirrored what he had once done alone in the dark. The difference, now there was light. There were companions. And when he left the next morning, Riverside had a new board in the break area. Small things, when everyone sees them, become big things. Back at Cedar Hill, Javier sat at the 13th door. A new employee, about 19, hands still stained with whiteboard marker, walked in. "You're the one who designed the quiet listening section, right?" he asked. Javier nodded. "I wrote a note. Didn't expect anyone to respond." "What did you write?" Javier asked. "I said I often feel uneasy using the restroom at night. That hallway is too dark. It just feels unsafe." "And who responded to you?" He showed a photo on his phone. "Tomorrow, the maintenance team will install 2 additional lights in hallway D. At the bottom, thank you for noticing what others overlooked." Javier looked at the photo and gently asked, "Have you thought about what you'll write next?" The young employee smiled. "This time, I plan to write, 'Thank you.'" Javier nodded slightly. Fires aren't only lit by actions. They're sustained by gratitude, even if it's just a small word. On the last day of December, a cold air blanketed Cedar Hill like a thin sheet, seeping through every door crack, hallway corner, and the floor sections where Javier had drawn red circles 6 months prior. The wall at the 13th door was now so covered with notes that an additional board had to be added. People called it the Truth Station. Unofficially, but everyone understood. That morning, Javier received a package from headquarters. On the outside, only a handwritten note. The end of the year isn't a time to look back, but to step forward. Inside wasn't a document, nor a new appointment letter, just an old photo, printed from last year's security camera footage. A man wearing a worn baseball cap, bending down to fix a broken wheel under the yellow light from the maintenance room. His face unclear, but everyone knew who it was. Accompanying it was a silver metal card, its edges hand-polished. No name, no code. Only a single engraved line. Key holder, final access. Javier looked at the card, quietly stood up, and walked towards the area the entire warehouse still referred to as the final door. In that door was located behind Warehouse D, an area no longer in use. A section of rusted steel wall, fitted with an old magnetic lock that hadn't functioned in a long time. It used to be a passage to the old logistics center, once home to the technical office, now abandoned. No one went there, but in the system it was still marked as active. Javier scanned the card. A soft beep sounded. A green light flashed briefly. The door opened. Inside was an empty, cold room, without furniture. But in the center stood a small metal box. On its lid, laser-engraved words. "A good system needs a heart, not just memory." Javier opened the box. Inside was a thin black leather notebook. No logo. He turned to the first page. If you're reading this, it means you've reached the end of a path most don't see. And you've kept going. The following pages contained notes. Not Javier's, but those of the original founder of the Cedar Hill warehouse system. In the early years when the company had only one center, the founder had lost his son in a workplace accident due to a technical error no one took responsibility for. Since then, he dedicated the rest of his life to building a system, not perfect, but transparent and fair. But over time, everything became structured. Whiteboards turned into electronic boards. Handwritten notes became forms. People became employee codes. And this room, once the direct safety consultation room, was closed, forgotten, hidden behind the shift schedule board. Javier turned to the last page. A recently added handwritten line, the ink still fresh. We're not looking for talent, but for those who see the small things and don't turn away. Below was Miles' signature. 2 weeks later, headquarters announced a new program, the Sentinel Project, a new initiative not to improve technology, but to restore internal kindness. Each warehouse in the system would have a key holder, not to inspect, but to listen. And the first position recognized, not through application, was Javier. In the quiet recognition ceremony, no stage, no live stream, Javier said only one sentence. If someone had ever asked my father, "What do you see?" perhaps I wouldn't have had to learn to see alone. New Year's Day, the first night shift of the new year, a group of new workers was assigned to Cedar Hill. When they reached the break area, one of them pointed to the note board at the 13th door and asked, "What's this?" A veteran worker replied, without turning around, "That's where people leave what others don't see and receive what everyone needs, someone to listen." A young girl whispered, "Sounds like ghosts." The other laughed, "No, you're mistaken. Ghosts hide." But Javier, he let people see him at the right time, in the right place. That night, Javier did his usual rounds, still wearing his old coat, holding a small flashlight, walking through each area, checking every corner. When he reached the old spot where he once fixed a broken wheel in the dark, he stopped. Now that spot had new lights, new cameras, fresh paint. But Javier didn't touch anything. He just stood there, took out a white piece of paper from his pocket and wrote, "I see people beginning to see again, and that's the most beautiful thing I've ever witnessed." He pinned the note to the corner of the bulletin board, then walked away. No need for recordings, no need for applause. He had completed his part. A week later, someone found that note. They didn't know who wrote it, but they added a line beneath it in blue ink. "Thank you. Now it's my turn to see." And so the fire continued to burn, not as a storm, not needing electronic boards, just small flames, from those who were once silent, now choosing to step forward. No one remembers what Javier said when he took the position. No one needs to. They remember how he walked, how he stopped when he saw what others overlooked, and how he opened the final door so that from then on, no one would have to walk alone in the dark again. A few months after Javier left Cedar Hill to take on the role of regional safety director, a silent video spread internally, not a press conference clip nor a conference speech, just a hallway 3 camera recording, a new employee bending down to pick up a fallen strap in the walkway, pinning it to the board as if it were the most natural thing. No one around, no applause. But what stunned viewers was the text on the back of his shirt, a new Cedar Hill uniform. "Everyone sees, but what do you choose to do?" That's all. No more words needed. But for those who knew Javier, who once worked in the dark, who were ignored when trying to do the right thing, that video was like a loud bell waking a system that had long slept in indifference. And you, the one watching this story to the very end, could be the next to continue that kindness. No title needed, no one watching. Just choose not to ignore when you can act. If this story moved you, made you think of someone who was once forgotten, who quietly kept the system from collapsing, leave a comment, share their name. Let the world know they deserve to be seen. Like if you believe silent kindness has the power to change. Subscribe to not miss stories that touch the best in each person. And most importantly, don't forget to look closer, because sometimes the change of an entire place lies in the quietest hands.